Hello viewers, welcome to the presentation on Michael Porter's 5 force or threat analysis. In this slide, you will be seeing 5 different type of threats an existing company will be facing. The threat from their own competitors, the threat from the supplier, the threat from the buyer, the threat from the new entrant, and from the threat of the substitute products. We have already captured in another video the threat of new entrants and the type of barriers can create to the new entrants, and we will provide the link for that particular one. So that balanced threats we will be seeing in this particular video. The threat of the supplier. The threat of the supplier group is very high if it is dominated by few companies, and so obviously they will be demanding very frequent price rises, particularly if the products are all unique in nature, critical for the requirement, and also least differentiated. Example, Intel chip supplies to PC or computer manufacturers. Obviously there are not many competitors available to provide the chips in the world. Second is, if the cost of supplier switching cost is very high. Let us take the case where a company called Manali Petrochemical was buying a particular chemical from Chennai Petroleum. So Manali Petroleum at one point of time thought that I think we should try an alternate supplier because they find the supplier is not reasonable. So Manali Petro decided to go to a nearest port to import the material, namely the Kadalur port, about 160 kilometers from Chennai. So they created some port infrastructure, like they created some barges, some temporary tanks, specialized transport vehicle to bring that supplies from the Kadalur port to Chennai, all that. And finally they incurred a huge amount of expenditure. So this is what we are basically talking about, cost of supplier switching cost basically. The supplier always poses a credible threat of forward integration, because let us take a very interesting example of mozzarella cheese for the manufacture of this pizza. So Amul was supplying this cheese to all these pizza manufacturers. At one point of time, Amul itself started being a manufacturer of pizza itself. That is a big challenge for all the pizza manufacturers. Suppose if the industry is not an important customer to a supplier group, again the threat is also very real. Let us take the case of a chlorine supply. Chlorine is actually supplied to large number of industries who is having boiler to produce a boiler feed water. Chlorine is also supplied to people who make chlorine chemicals. Chlorine is actually a co-product produced in the caustic soda chlorine plant, and caustic soda is driven by the global demand supply position. Obviously it passes through a cycle. So whenever the chlorine supply production comes down or reduced, the first people who are affected are only the other consumers and not the chlorine chemical manufacturers. So normally what happens, these chlorine consumers, they used to keep a large stock of chlorine, so to ensure any supply disruption. Let us take the case of threat from the buyer. The threat from the buyer group is very high if it purchases in large volume, and so obviously demand very high discount, high quality and better service. If it is particularly so, if it is a standard product. The product it purchases from the industry represents a significant fraction of its cost. Let us take the case of a motor supplier to manufacture a wet grinder. In a wet grinder, the major cost is a motor, but still the motor person may not be able to supply the motor to the customer, whereas a wet grinder is so. So in such case, the threat is obviously quite high from the buyer. When the quality of the buyer product is affected by the supplier product, then the buyer will be less price sensitive. Let us take two suppliers. One is a supplier of starter motor to an automobile manufacturer. Another is a supplier of seat cover to an automobile manufacturer. Obviously, the supplier of starter motor is very important for the auto manufacturer. So you will be posing some threat. The auto manufacturer also will be playing in a very good manner. Whereas the seat cover, obviously, it is a very standard product. So obviously, the relationship or this one will be quite different. The last thing about the threat of buyer is the credible threat of backward integration. The classical example you can think of is the Nirma manufacture into linear alkyl benzene. Linear alkyl benzene actually is the basic raw material to manufacture the washing powder. In fact, before the Nirma started manufacturing, Nirma is one of the major consumers of this lab. The major manufacturers are only Reliance Petroleum and Tamil Nadu Petro Products. So at one point of time, Nirma thought we'll go for backward integration and started manufacturing the raw material itself. So with the result, what happened, all the consumers, the major manufacturers of lab lost a major consumer. Also, the consumer has become their competitor also. It is a very interesting case. Next is a threat of substitutes. The threat of substitutes is quite real if the substitute products are all cheaper. Let us take a very interesting case where recently you would have seen Amul has announced that they're going to manufacture butter biscuit. The reason being, all the existing butter biscuit manufacturers are using chemicals instead of butter because they're all very cost effective. Similarly, you would have seen the very classical case of replacement substitution between coffee and tea, soft drinks versus tender coconut, all these cases. The substitute products may minimize labor content with better efficiency. In such case also the threat of substitute is quite high. Let us take the case of this drone delivery versus a manual delivery. See, today with the drone technology is getting perfected, it is offering a lot of flexibility, cost reduction and all that. So very soon, bulk of the manual delivery done by the various e-commerce people all will be handled by the drones. The substitute products sometimes will provide more options to the customer. Let us take the interesting example of leather bags versus polyurethane or PVC bag. If you see the PVC or PU bag, they look like exactly like a leather. It will give more flexibility, more color, so many options it provides to the customer, better than even a leather bag. So sometimes the substitute will be a real challenge to handle. Last is the rivalry among the existing player. When the threat from the existing players will be quite high. If the competitors are many in number and equal in size, like what you are seeing in cement industry or fan industry or two-wheeler industry. Suppose the industry is growing very low. For example, the industry growth is only about 4 or 5%, whereas the player is trying to grow at about 8% or 10%. Obviously, he will try to snatch the market share from some of the slow growing people. So the threat will be quite high. If the products lacks differentiation, an interesting example we can think of if the FMCG products. If you see the FMCG products, they are largely driven by the brand equity. So otherwise, the products basically lack differentiation in performance or whatever the way you talk it. The fixed costs are high, and so plant has to be operated. That is also another compulsion why the threat from the existing place will be quite high. Sometimes the assets will be very specialized in nature, so exit barriers are very high. So obviously they'll continue to produce, flood the market, and provide a lot of threat to the existing player. In certain cases, the capacity is augmented in large increments. For example, if you take a cement industry or steel industry driven by the economy of scale, and obviously they'll be flooding the market. So obviously the threat from the existing place will be quite high. So we have seen threat from different segments, and many threats are all we have to really assess the threat and whether we'll be able to mitigate the threat. In certain areas, we may not be able to avoid the threat. You have to live with the threat. So accordingly, you have to evolve strategies to ensure that the threats are under control. Hope you would have really enjoyed the presentation. The presentation is useful to all of you. Thank you for patient listening to you. Thank you once again.